Hey Sats fans, how's it going? Welcome back to Swan Signal Live. I'm Brady Swenson. This is episode 80. We're going to be talking with David Zell and Matthew Pines of the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And it's going to be a fantastic episode. I have lots of personal questions and interest in what's going on in the public policy world and just the public policy conversation in general around Bitcoin, which is really ramped up over the past year or so. Before we dive into this great episode, let's check in with Swan for just a minute. Swan is blowing up. There's so much happening behind the scenes, and there's so much that's going to be released over the next few months in quarters 2 and 3. Some of those exciting new product features include the app, which has been a long time coming. It's in test flight right now on the App Store and also available to test on the Google Play Store. Through Google Play, if you'd like to get involved in the testing of the app on test flight or on Android, just DM me on Twitter. I'll send you a link to Telegram, and you can jump in there and test with about 500 other Bitcoiners who have access right now to the functioning app. You can smash by. There's lots of other cool stuff that's going on in there. We are also launching Swan Advisor Services. That product is just about ready for prime time, but we're still taking people to beta test Swan Advisor Services. So if you have a financial advisor in your life who you would like to help find a spot to buy Bitcoin and manage Bitcoin for their clients' portfolios, Swan Advisor Services is the way to go. It's run by the great Andy Edstrom, author of Why Buy Bitcoin. And so really excited to get that product out the door. We've also got IRAs coming very soon, so you can roll over your IRAs or open a new IRA account and hold Bitcoin directly in your IRA. We also have Swan Private, of course, which is just trucking right along for businesses. We have the fastest onboarding for business entities in the entire industry. It can happen as fast as 2 days. We've had same day business onboarding through Swan Private happen. So it's incredible where, if you go to Coinbase or something or Kraken, it can take weeks or months to get a business onboarded properly. And of course, high net worth individuals looking to buy $1,000, $100,000 or more of Bitcoin in a year. So there's tons going on at Swan, growing. The team is growing. If you're looking for a job in the industry, check out bitcoinerjobs.com. And you'll find all the open Swan positions there, as well as positions from Bitcoin-only companies all over the industry. All right, let's dive into this one with Matthew and David. Gentlemen, how's it going? Matthew, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me.
And David, you as well.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Absolutely, yeah. David, let's start with you and just give us a rundown on what the Bitcoin Policy Institute is doing, how long you guys have been around, what your goals are, and what you guys are up to right now.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for having us. The Bitcoin Policy Institute was a pipe dream of mine for a while, and was something that I had toyed around with. Then the infrastructure bill happened, about a year ago. And it became really clear that, the people who were sort of spreading misinformation about Bitcoin were not just like, angry trolls on Twitter who were upset that they told everyone not to buy in like 2012 or 2013 and are now just perpetually salty, but it's like actual US politicians. And, not only is it kind of, there's sort of lies and misinformation about Bitcoin from politicians, but it's now like attached to material action. Like there are consequences to that misinformation. It isn't just that it makes, Thanksgiving dinners uncomfortable when you're having to explain to people why everything they've heard about Bitcoin from the mainstream media is wrong. Now you've got people like Brad Sherman actively calling for bans on Bitcoin, Elizabeth Warren going almost that far, but not quite saying it. And so, the whole point of BPI was to sort of bring together people who had a deep knowledge of Bitcoin, but also had expertise in various fields that intersect with it, whether that's economics, policy, energy, national security, philosophy, law, all of these things, and basically present accurate information about Bitcoin to journalists, lawmakers, and the general public. It was really clear to me when I kept seeing all of these articles about Bitcoin, and they cite the same, 4 or 5 like academics who will kind of just line up to say things that aren't true about Bitcoin. And we're not a company. We're decentralized. So there's no head of comms, there's no PR, there's no CEO you can call up. And it was clear, it's like Balaji says, if it enrages, it engages, like the media likes a debate. So why aren't they showing the benefits of Bitcoin? Well, my thesis was that it was because no one was kind of making a concerted effort. Say, hey, we will give you their side of this debate. We will tell you things about Bitcoin that you aren't hearing from the experts that you're talking to currently. So yeah, that was kind of the vision of BPI was, can we place op-eds about Bitcoin in outlets? Can we start taking meetings with staffers and like policymakers in DC? And can we show them this, that there's a lot of depth here and that, there's a lot of misinformation about Bitcoin and that bluntly, Bitcoin is good for the United States. And so, yeah, we wanted to form a research organization that could provide that perspective to these different audiences that aren't necessarily plugged in to Swan or aren't on Bitcoin Twitter. So we started running on January 1st of this year at a minimum scale, just to kind of test hypotheses, right? Like see, will people listen to us? Can we get op-eds placed in mainstream outlets? All of this stuff. So we ran for 90 days at a minimum scale, and we're really successful. We got a bunch of op-eds placed. Matthew went on like C-SPAN. I'm pretty sure that was the first time C-SPAN has ever had a pro Bitcoin guest on there. And Matthew talked for like an hour, kind of in a way that I think no one who watches that show was ready for. And so, yeah, now we're kind of scaling up. So I've been sort of quietly fundraising behind the scenes, looking to bring on some of our experts into more full-time roles. Got a bunch of white papers coming out. So far, Matthews has been the big hit. He wrote a massive behemoth on why Bitcoin may be a strategic asset for the United States. And some of our other writers like Margot Pace and Troy Cross have an amazing white paper on Bitcoin and the environment and mining. It's going to be coming out soon. So yeah, the plan is to kind of scale up, start producing a lot more content, get engaged with Biden's executive order, which calls for all these different agencies to research Bitcoin. We're going to do some of their homework for them and tell them what we think about these issues. And kind of keep doing the work we're doing, but at a larger scale.
Is the organization funded by businesses in the industry?
It's funded by all sorts of people. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we take donations from companies, from individuals, from other groups. We receive grants from other think tanks, other nonprofits. So yeah, it's a pretty diverse base of people and groups.
Cool. So Matthew, as David mentioned, you wrote this great piece on Bitcoin and U.S. national security. I have read the first couple of pages. I haven't been able to get through the entire thing yet, but read through it to kind of get the gist of what you were trying to get into. And I can't wait I really do want to read the rest of it. This conversation has been, really started as far as I can tell. I mean, I've been in Bitcoin for about 5 years, but the idea of Bitcoin as a national security concern has really been talked about more recently over the past, 12 to 18 months, kind of more in earnest. And so it's great to see this contribution to that discussion. I would love to hear you just summarize what what your takeaways here are and why you think this is an important narrative to bring to Washington.
Yes, certainly. So I approached that white paper really with a few things in mind. So one is, I think within the Bitcoin community, we obviously know Bitcoin is valuable and is going to become, globally successful. But that's not going to be that's not going to be a straight line, right? And the line is going to go through a lot of legacy institutions. Of course, the U.S. government itself is probably the biggest institution that line is going to go through. And so just from a prudent perspective, someone who spent about 10 years helping the government think through kind of low probability but high consequence scenarios, both for the good and for the bad, that was not something that the U.S. government was looking at. We've looked at lots of different scenarios that are much less likely than the chance of Bitcoin, say, monetizing to the equivalent of gold in the next 10 years. And yet we weren't doing that for Bitcoin. So it just seemed like a gap that needed to be filled, and a topic that hadn't been broached in a serious manner by folks kind of that can kind of speak the language of kind of the U.S. national security kind of community, and try to act as a bridge between those two different worlds, but also to apply some more rigorous kind of analytical thinking to that question, which Bitcoiners, obviously like to think through the details and be paranoid. But I also want to look through what is the sort of near-term sort of sequence of steps that one would imagine as Bitcoin continues to monetize. We often like to jump ahead to sort of hyper Bitcoinization, but sort of thinking through the process is I think the most difficult part, right? How do you imagine what is already a very complex geopolitical macroeconomic situation that would be very difficult to analyze in the absence of Bitcoin? How do you try to think through that dynamic now that Bitcoin is going to become a more and more important factor at play? So it makes it very difficult to analyze, very difficult to sort of reason too far into the future. But I think we need to start laying out some of those details. But I approach that piece first from a perspective of kind of how does the U.S. government think about national security, right? So the first source that I went to try to anchor that analysis was President Biden's interim national security strategic guidance, which he released upon taking office in March of last year. And in that document, they sort of lay out kind of three pillars of U.S. national strength. And when I read those, I thought, hey, this is pretty much a clean narrative that I could build Bitcoin into. And so that's basically how I structured the sort of three theses of that white paper, where essentially how Bitcoin supports U.S. Enduring sources of national strength, specifically national economic strength. Second was how Bitcoin can help support our efforts to counter our strategic adversaries, specifically China. And third, how can Bitcoin support the global adoption of our value system, right? And I felt like there's a pretty clean and compelling narrative that doesn't require stretching the truth by any means, just telling the facts such as I see them at the moment about how Bitcoin is leading to a renaissance in the domestic energy industry, as we see Bitcoin mining flock and develop dramatically in Texas, Oklahoma, helping to monetize stranded assets, wind assets, solar, flare natural gas, et cetera, but also the broader economic implications of the development of the industry at large, capital markets development, fundraising, IPOs, public and private companies, job growth. Like, these are all positive economic developments from Bitcoin being successful in the United States that accrues to our national economic strength, which is a core pillar of our national security. So that's a summary of that first pillar. The second was countering China, and this takes a little bit more to unpack, so I won't go too down the rabbit hole, but I think folks are aware of the geopolitical tensions, the structure of the global order post World War II has been obviously American-led, sort of rules-based liberal world order premised on a number of international institutions, including sort of a monetary order that situates the dollar, the U.S. Treasury security, kind of at its heart. And of the past number of years, we've seen kind of a rising axis of authoritarians emerge around kind of an alignment between Russia and China to dominate Eurasia and the associated kind of commodities and finished goods production supply chain that we're now seeing kind of the consequences of. And China has an ambitious program of challenging that Western-led order and the dollar system that order is built upon. And we're sort of seeing some of those initial moves start to play out, which is a major strategic national security challenge to the United States. And so I wanted to think through, okay, how could Bitcoin sort of assist or how does a development itself organically counter the ambitions of this sort of authoritarian system and system of systems? Because it's not just a government system, it's a technology system that they're trying to develop and impose around the world that includes their digital currency. And so the digital yuan, the DCEP kind of technology suite is sort of a package of authoritarianism as a service, technologies and political and economic support that China is offering to developing countries around the world that goes hand in hand with their efforts at spreading the money around through something called the Belt and Road Initiative, where they have been taking since 2013 the dollars that they accumulate from our structural trade deficits, and instead of recycling those into our debts, have been relending them around the world as part of a massive program of dollar-denominated overseas lending to buy up hard assets, ports, rails, infrastructure investments in those developing markets, buy up strategic influence along the way, and generally try to squeeze out sort of U.S. influence in the sort of Eurasian periphery, but also extending even into South America and into Europe. So the Chinese, and the U.S. government recognizes China as a major strategic sort of peer competitor and sort of the major competitor for the next several decades. And their efforts to use the suite of sort of monetary technologies as well as other tools of surveillance essentially that they're exporting is a major challenge to not just the United States but to global freedom, right? If you're in a developing market, you don't have much of a choice about whether your national government adopts a Chinese technology suite that essentially exports the same sorts of social credit systems, surveillance, control that they're developing domestically. So if you believe in the sort of small L liberal value system that at least America sort of holds up for itself, even if it doesn't meet those values in practice all the time, that is a major problem. And so I sort of tried to dig into how Bitcoin could help both reinforce those value systems, which is sort of a tangible tool to spread freedom, folks that can hold their own wealth in a way that's as difficult for their potentially corrupt local or national governments to confiscate, give them a sense of autonomy, personal freedom, and property rights in a circumstance where property rights are very difficult to secure. So that's was a key angle. But yeah, so going into the geopolitical angle is a major developing thing that really 2-3 years ago was more hypothetical, right? Bitcoin was so small that it really wasn't a serious kind of real possibility. And, obviously Bitcoiners knew it was going to happen, inevitably. But when you get to $1 trillion market cap, you're only a 10x away from reaching parity with gold, and Bitcoin's done 10x's going back over the past 2-3 years. So if you're not seriously analyzing the possibility of that happening and not trying to think through the second and third order implications and trying to position yourself to take strategic advantage, even though you can't control Bitcoin, if you leave that opportunity on the field, if you squander it, then someone else is going to pick up the ball. So that was kind of my intent with that piece.
Yeah, it's interesting, David. We've seen a change of tune from the administration in the past couple of months. Biden issued an executive order to direct the Treasury to kind of start researching into the space and providing recommendations. We saw the Treasury Secretary come out and give a little history lesson about Bitcoin and talk about it in a way that was much more engaging, much more dovish, to borrow a word from FedSpeak, about Bitcoin. What do you think about these recent developments? Is this a win from the Bitcoin Policy Institute super early?
No, I don't think it's I would love to say that it is, but no, I think they're born out of the same thing. The most overarching message coming out of the administration sort of mirrors what Matthew is talking about. I think he beat them to it a little bit, but whether or not you're pro Bitcoin or anti Bitcoin or whatever, the days of kind of just sitting back in the armchair and pontificating on it are kind of over. It's real now, and it's not going anywhere. And so that's the main message that I think really came through the executive order was like it or not, this stuff is here. The question is now what? And for us, we're going to be, I think in a lot of ways, making the same argument that a lot of early advocates of the internet did. I think it's just again sort of Balaji, someone who mentions this in a lot of podcasts or interviews that he does. This is something that I noticed is that early advocacy of the internet was tough. People didn't even fully understand how big of a deal it was going to be. Even some of the most bullish people on the internet were like, yeah, it's imagine your town forum, but now you get to your town hall, but now you get to do it online. People understood all of the ways in which the internet may replace kind of analog vestigial systems what they didn't really appreciate was that most of the changes of the internet would be, and of course Paul Krugman famously didn't predict this, would be all of the new things that the internet would kind of render capable where otherwise it hadn't been. This sort of entire new branches of things. And yeah, I mean, in the early days, it was hard to tell what the benefit of the internet would be. There were tons of hit pieces that compared its power use to entire nations. And I mean, commercial use of the internet wasn't even allowed until like the National Science Foundation said so in like the early 90s. I think what we're doing is sort of saying that the same thing has happened here. This technology has not been well understood, and most of its benefits and most of its impacts, are very hard to predict. They're just going to kind of happen. But in the same way that the internet wound up being good, I think Bitcoin, is as well. And I think that's what a message that the government is like prepared to hear and actually take well. Like we understand that the open flow of information is good for democracy. That's why the State Department funds internet access all over the world. And it took us a while to get there. And there were some people that were, sort of saying that, well, the internet will end authoritarianism. Of course, it didn't do that. And so the internet may not have lived up to the hype of destroying like the CCP or like whatever. But it wound up being profoundly useful to the United States. And I think for a lot of the same reasons, this open protocol that allows for the free flow of capital, it's of course going to be good for, like Matthew said, those small lowercase l liberal countries and bad for illiberal countries. So yeah, major takeaway is that I think the government is waking up to the idea that at minimum, this technology is here to stay. The big question is it good for us or is it bad for us? And to what extent do we need to craft policies that maximize the benefits and minimize the risks, the same way that the government did with the internet? There are not enough people out there giving critical thought to how this is going to like change the kind of fundamental composition of like global finance. There are a lot of people, I think, who are thinking about this stuff who reflexively think that it's really bad. It's here, like non-state, private, internet money, whatever. And the reflexive take is that this is competition with the dollar. This is used by terrorists and money launderers and criminals. And surely its only benefit could be for those who are doing illicit acts. And I think that there is a massive need for people who see the bigger picture. And I think Bitcoiners have kind of been on this wave for a really long time. And so, yeah, like a lot of the work that I do is less like original research and more just like taking things that were on a talk forum post in like 2014
Yeah.
and kind of like, look, this stuff is like true now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing if you go back into the early days, how much of this stuff has already been discussed. I mean, it's amazing. The entire block size war, for instance, was debated in 2011 to 2013, and then just kind of rehashed for years and years after that. But that applies to anything.
You can't really say anything new about Bitcoin. It's impossible.
Yeah, it seems that way. Well, I wonder about your guys' take on, and I'll pass this to Matthew first, on bipartisanship in Bitcoin. Now, it's a lot of people will say like this is kind of a right-leaning issue. Libertarians, Republicans, that's where we see most of the kind of outspoken supporters in the political sphere are from, right-leaning parties. It's not exclusive, obviously, and there's still a chance to prevent Bitcoin's absolute capture into the hellhole of partisanship in Washington. And I know, there's a few other organizations like Sat Center, for instance, that are kind of, I guess, what you could call like sister organizations to the Bitcoin Policy Institute that are sort of working toward this end of trying to keep Bitcoin out of that partisan trap, because we know what can happen once an issue gets in there. So Matthew, is this part of the Bitcoin Policy Institute's effort, like concerted effort? Is there a stated goal sort of to try to maintain bipartisanship for Bitcoin? And even if not, do you think it's important?
Well, I'll take the first part. So I think, we try to adopt what Bitcoin, adopts, which is fundamental neutrality, right? As a tool that will be for everyone. And so, along the way, right, it's going to get trapped up in politics, and so you have to be conscious of that. But no, we don't have a particular kind of political ideology that undergirds our thinking and writing about Bitcoin. But we have to, be pragmatic, because we're talking about, influencing and shaping kind of the broader public conversation around Bitcoin. And we live in a highly polarized and politicized media environment. And so you just have to be conscious of that. And that can change very quickly. So, what you think happens this year could happen next, completely differently the next year. So I think it's important to keep an eye on kind of your longer term objective, which is to see Bitcoin be successful in the United States, regardless of which party is in power or how the party systems evolve or how political debates kind of mature over time. Like Bitcoin is a much longer term phenomenon. I think we want to have our research and analysis kind of stand up to the test of time. So that's kind of our sort of, I guess, our core approach there. But you have to be sort of tactical, right, about how to understand where the current debate is and where the sticking points that are holding up different people in different parts of the policy process. And I do think there is, while Bitcoin itself isn't political in that sense, Bitcoin does have a clear kind of anti-authoritarian sort of endogenous force to it. And there's authoritarians on the right and there's authoritarians on the left. And so depending on where the pendulum is swinging in terms of kind of an axis of authoritarianism relative to those different political poles, there'll be a perception of antagonism to Bitcoin on both ends. And so that's where I think, to the extent there is kind of a political reaction to Bitcoin, it's from folks that have maybe a natural inclination to authoritarian control, where they want to make sure that certain systems of power, certain structures that maybe their careers or their influence are predicated on are potentially challenged by Bitcoin. That's where the friction comes in, and that exists on both the right and the left. So that's, I guess my take on that question. But yeah, I think there is an aspect of being pragmatic in the near term, understanding where certain arguments are salient, right? So obviously the energy argument is much more salient for the folks on the left, but in 2 years, different administrations in power could be a completely different set of concerns that now dominate the political atmosphere. It could be the fact that Bitcoin is somehow perceived as a threat to the dollar, and maybe for some folks on the right see that as a challenge to the good old USA, and it could become a different cudgel being used to whack Bitcoin. So I try not to sort of place too much kind of on the kind of the near term political dynamics, but you have to be aware of it and be prepared to adapt as it moves.
Yeah, David, what about you? And I would like to hear, since so you're making the analogy back to the internet's history, if there was it a partisan issue back then as well, or was it pretty much down the line and there were like pro tech supporters and like people who were more skeptical, but it wasn't really a partisan issue?
Yeah, well, I should be clear that my knowledge of the early days of internet advocacy comes from secondhand research. I'm a little young, so I wasn't like really around.
Yeah, obviously.
So I'm probably the worst person to ask that question. My gut tells me that probably no. At least not nearly in the way. But I mean, that's compared to other like controversial technology, right? Like AI is like another example of a technology that is widely misunderstood. Subject to really, really out there criticism and like really like intense advocacy as well. But AI is not like politicized really either. I think the answer to that question is no. It's probably not the same.
Do you think the bipartisanship thing is important? Like, I mean, I'll just put this out there. Obviously, like Bitcoin doesn't care. Like Bitcoin's inevitable in my mind. It's gonna happen no matter what, and if it like it's gonna roll over any resistance. But I do feel like there is a way, like we can affect the way that Bitcoin is adopted with education. And if something does, like I said, get sort of pulled into that gravitational pull of partisanship in this country, it can really hurt like a technological adoption, for instance, right? Like you definitely see in this country. So if we're interested as Americans to try to, as you guys are, saying like it's in America's interest to adopt Bitcoin and embrace it, like I could see if it becomes a partisan fight that's just not going to happen for quite some time, and we're going to get passed up by other countries who are doing the right thing.
Right. Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts on this, so I'll try to be succinct.
Okay.
I think that it is in Bitcoin users' interest that Bitcoin remain bipartisan, and I also think that it's in Bitcoin users' interest that Bitcoin be allowed to flourish here in the United States. So, I agree with your perspective that, like, over the long run, Bitcoin will probably, it's just the best money that is out there right now,
Right.
and will probably kind of slowly chip away at everything else. And so, you can get caught up in this sort of semantic debate of, like, does Bitcoin need any particular thing? I think it's more practical to kind of remember that Bitcoin may be this, like, incredibly robust, resilient, distributed software. We are like flesh sacks. Like, we are like human beings who are, like, way more vulnerable to the state in a lot of ways than Bitcoin is. And so I would take this kind of in two directions. One would be that our lives as American Bitcoiners will be way worse if the government thinks that the technology that we're supporting, the thing that we're choosing to save in, to build with, is bad for the government. Like, that is not a useful outcome for us. No one wants to kind of be pitted against the United States, and frankly, the sort of history of people that have been viewed by the U.S. as enemies doesn't tend to go well for the people the U.S. regards as enemies. The other point is that the road to hyper-Bitcoinization is much easier to imagine when a lot of that is happening here in the States, right? Like, people can have their critiques of the United States all they want. We are still kind of clearly the best place to innovate. We have the sort of deepest capital markets in the world. We have the best IP laws in the world. And we have, like, some of the strongest sort of assurances of, like, personal anywhere else. Rather, compared to anywhere else. And so I think the amount of innovation that gets to happen on Bitcoin when there's a favorable environment in the United States is higher. And it's all just kind of downstream, like, there, like, more capital, more innovation. Bitcoin gets in more people's hands and becomes more useful to more people when it's, viewed favorably, by the United States. So tying that back to the idea of bipartisanship, it is, like, much easier to work in a space and to be building on a technology that isn't kind of subject to regulatory uncertainty, where every 4 years you're like, oh shoot, like, will we be in a pro-Bitcoin? Will we have a pro-Bitcoin presidency or an anti-Bitcoin presidency? That is not good for a lot of reasons. And so, one way you kind of avoid that is by doing what Matthew said. You sort of make arguments that are deliberate in their being, like, kind of radically centrist and, like, grounded. Like, we're talking about Bitcoin's impact on U.S. competitiveness, on national security, on our ability to be energy independent. And I think, at least something that I personally believe, is that despite the really high levels of partisanship that we're experiencing now, fundamentally most people want the same things. They have the same sorts of values, the same fears and anxieties about the world, the same hopes for the future. And I think that Bitcoin is just, like, obviously good for the world. Like, the world is a much better place with Bitcoin in it than without it. And sometimes you just need different language to speak to different people. Like, people are passionate about different things. Like Matthew said, like, some people, I mean, the biggest thing for them is they think Bitcoin, I'm not going to listen or engage or hear about all of the powerful ways that Bitcoin may align with their values if they're so convinced up front that it's, perpetuating climate change, and that's the big thing they care about. And then on the flip side, right, like, there are so many people out there who are like, I don't care at all. Like, climate change doesn't matter to me. Like, that's the least of my concerns. What I care about is the strength of America, and they view Bitcoin as an attack on the dollar. And it's the same thing. It's like, if people don't see that Bitcoin is additive to the United States and beneficial to the United States, they're not going to hear all of the great reasons why Bitcoin is good if their kind of majority is not being addressed. So yeah, it's important. Yes, you are right that Bitcoin doesn't need like approval It doesn't need favorability to exist. But I think it definitely benefits from it to flourish. And I think if you believe that Bitcoin is good and that the world benefits from the more people who are using Bitcoin, then it's like really a good idea to be bipartisan, and to be viewed as additive to the United States, at least in our case, and not sort of working against it.
Yeah, that's great, man. That's really well said. Let's talk a little bit about a couple of recent developments that sort of are antithesis to one another. First of all, New York regulations. I think there's a law that is going to the Senate, the state Senate in New York, that's issues a moratorium on proof of work mining. Meanwhile, Fort Worth, Texas is like pleb mining with a few miners in their city hall. So it's interesting to see these developments, and it's another, kind of beautiful aspect of the United States where there's these 50 different states that can sort of test different policies and approaches to things, and people can make decisions based on those real world tests, et cetera. So any thoughts from you, Matthew, on this emerging trend of states experimenting with Bitcoin, what we're learning from that in terms of political support for mining in this particular case, or any other aspect of Bitcoin?
Yeah, and I'm not, I guess I have sort of kind of obvious interpretation, which is what you said, which is, you're going to have experiments. You're going to see certain states, drop the ball, and other states pick up the ball. And I see this as somewhat similar, although there's probably some nuances associated with like cannabis and cannabis legislation, right? There are certain states who were very early on, like the legalization wave, passed state laws. A lot of businesses got started there. And it took time for those to get momentum. It took time for kind of the national conversation around marijuana laws to shift. And you're still having kind of a challenge for those sort of advocates to get kind of a federal law passed. And it's kind of a challenge for that industry. But you can sort of see kind of as an analogous case of how kind of state by state approaches start to sort of generate their own momentum. Now, that being said, right, you would prefer there to be a more coherent approach to this industry, given that Bitcoin doesn't respect particular boundaries, right? It's a global asset. It's a global network. And the industries in the United States that we want to have sort of be sort of fostered and innovate on top of that, right, are going to have trouble if certain key states sort of block themselves off from that network. And yeah, they'll hurt themselves. But Bitcoin will continue chugging along. I do think you're going to see momentum, especially in the Bitcoin mining, right? So Bitcoin mining is itself kind of one of the most sort of geographically and politically anchored aspects of the network, right? You have to find large power sources. You have to have local agreements. You have to pay local taxes. You have to get approvals and sites, and they're often the most tangible manifestations of the network, right? You've got big warehouses. You can do tours with hard hats, and politicians can show up. You've got jobs. You can point to something physical. And in certain jurisdictions, that's great. You can point to something physical. In other jurisdictions, right, because of sort of America has a very strong NIMBYist, not in my backyard strain. And it's not, and Bitcoin, I think, is just a new thing that's going to get caught up in that, right? There's lots of sort of public policy mistakes and weird irrational things that we've done with our land use, our economic development, our real estate kind of development that don't make a whole lot of rational economic sense, but that's just the nature of our political system. And I think, Bitcoin is gonna go through the same sort of matrix of constraint. I don't think net it's going to lead to any strategic challenges to it, right? Over the long term, I think some of the state by state things are going to get ironed out. But yeah, I mean, where you can, right, you can exert political pressure on local officials and say, hey, this is actually really good for our state. And I think in New York, you can talk to Troy Cross and Margaret. They basically say New York itself has one of the higher average in terms of renewable generation in the grid. And so if you kick miners out of New York and they relocate to a state grid that doesn't have as much renewable penetration, you're actually going to create more carbon emissions and not less. So if your policy objective is to reduce the carbon emissions associated with the Bitcoin network, you want to attract Bitcoin miners to where the amount of renewables.
It's not like it's going to prevent miners from operating to pass this law.
It's counterproductive, and a lot of it is mostly political signaling, not sort of rationally informed. And this is the challenge, right? We're trying to sort of get factual information into the hands of some of those legislators, but that's how the sausage is made, and sometimes it doesn't change minds, and it's that's the way the cookie crumbles.
Yeah. Any thoughts on state level adoption? U.S. state level adoption, David?
Yeah. I mean, thoughts. Broadly, I think there will be a sandbox, kind of like both of you alluded to, and it will be clear in time who benefits from what policies. And so, New York has often been kind of a policy leader in that they're willing to kind of test out and try more controversial and novel policies. I think this could play out in, there's sort of two views you can take. Like, one view is that this sets off like a chain reaction where every subsequent proof of work moratorium is marginally easier to justify than the prior, because you can point to the one before it and say, well, New York did this, so it's reasonable, and we should do the same thing. We should follow New York. The other view you could take, is that people will wait and see, and what they will find, if I were, is that a lot of Bitcoin capital leaves New York. It goes to Texas or goes to Wyoming. And so then you may have the, states kind of are sitting there watching to see what happens. And they realize, oh, hey, if we kind of moralize, energy usage, because that was so bizarre about the New York stuff, is that, they're not coming after fossil fuel plants. They're just saying that there are certain things that you can use fossil fuels for, and there are certain things that you cannot now use fossil fuels for, which is just super bizarre. And to Matthew's point, indicative of this being a lot more sort of symbolic and politically motivated rather than being policy or kind of outcome motivated. And so, yeah, maybe we see a lot of capital leave New York, and they kind of fall on their sword, so no other state has to. I mean, we'll just have to see how it plays out. But broadly, it's definitely good that states can experiment. That some are going to be a lot more bullish on Bitcoin, others are not. And I think that as states continue to see the upside of pro-Bitcoin policy, if we start to see states, passing laws that say, we will not allow for the, infringement of your right to self-custody, if we will allow you to, whatever. I mean, basically, whatever kind of laws or lack of regulations that attract capital and Bitcoin talent, I do think that gets a little bit of a snowball effect, where the states that are early in their support of Bitcoin reap outsized gains, and everyone else kind of like FOMO's in, reminiscent of Bitcoin itself. So I think it is also, for the same reason, good that states have the opportunity to really screw up their Bitcoin policy, because I'd rather a state do it and kind of have that empirical example to learn from, rather than the federal government, for example, messing up in a substantive way on Bitcoin policy, because that's going to be a lot more impactful, a lot harder to backtrack from, and the kind of signaling and spillover effects of nationally harmful policy are just much more substantial than that of state policy, a sort of policy leader state like New York, where a lot of eyes are kind of watching them to see what they do.
Yeah, I agree completely. It is a beautiful thing about this country that we can have, 50 different independent laboratories to test public policy before passing on a federal level, if even necessary. There was an interesting proposal. There's a bill out, the eCash bill. I'm not sure what they've made it into an acronym, obviously, but I don't know what it stands for. It's a bill that directs the Secretary of the Treasury to develop a pilot digital dollar technology that replicates the privacy respecting features of physical cash in order to promote greater financial inclusion, maximize consumer protection, data privacy, and advance U.S. efforts to develop and regulate digital assets. It's just missing a couple of adjectives there, and otherwise you're describing Bitcoin. So it's interesting, very important adjectives. But I'd love to get your take on this particular bill, Matthew, if you have thought much about it. It's not a CBDC because it'd be issued by the Treasury and not by the Fed. But interesting. I haven't looked much into it. I don't know if you have. Would love to hear any thoughts you have on it.
Yeah, so I know some of my colleagues, William Luther and Andrew Bailey, have really made that a focus of some of their analysis and research. So I have sort of picked up secondhand, but I'm by no means an expert on that particular bill. I do know that there's an interesting cleavage in even some of the more kind of progressive like MMTers on the question of like changes to the national monetary system, and so we tend to sort of lump them all into the CBDC bucket. But there's a strain of analysts and sort of policy people. There's someone on Twitter. His name is Rohan Gray, I believe that's his last name.
Yep.
He always likes to go toe to toe with a lot of Bitcoiners, but he's definitely also against the CBDC and kind of the traditional model of a Fed liability, direct sort of liability of the Fed that's issued to retail through kind of a digital kind of mechanism. And yeah, he sort of, I think, has been, whether directly or indirectly, part of the development of that eCash proposal, which is, at least in my sort of cursory understanding, is meant to kind of split the difference a bit between the traditional CBDC model, where essentially direct Fed liability, and he's an MMT, or he wants essentially the Treasury to control monetary policy, and so he wants to have the Treasury, the political officials, kind of cut out the middleman. And why would we want the Fed to run? This is me putting myself in his shoes. Like, as an MMT, or why would you want the Fed to run a CBDC? But at the same time, I think he is conscious of the privacy risk associated with that type of technology. So if your objective as an MMTer is for the political authority to control the money supply, but you also had kind of a privacy concern, well, that would be your solution, right? You'd want to settle on an update to the monetary structure where the Treasury Department can control the issuance of essentially a form of digital cash that still is controlled by the political authority, right? They can control new issuance, that they can use that to have kind of macro prudential effects on the money supply, but go straight from the Treasury to the population. So from like a privacy side, I would say score it better than a CBDC, right? But it still suffers kind of the core flaw of, well, you have political control of the monetary system, and you're putting a lot of trust in just a different set of technocrats to sort of tune the dials of the issuance and management of that sort of digital currency regime to achieve certain policy objectives, which some folks think that's what's necessary, and other folks think that's right for disaster. But it does open up, it sort of broadens the debate, makes it a little bit more nuanced associated, instead of between, say, just Bitcoin versus CBDC. You're going to see, I think, more like this, right? Kind of a different options that sort of are motivated by different political attitudes, but also now trying to take advantage of the same sort of suite of digital technologies that are now available to sort of fill out the sort of the space of possibilities, right? And Bitcoin is sort of clearly maximizes on a certain anchor in that larger space, and different people have different political attitudes. They're going to sort of try to come up with different models that go along different axes there. So that's an interesting development there. I don't know exactly its likelihood of passing, but I think it's sort of the first step in getting it into the broader conversation.
It's fascinating to me that there's a competition potentially between the Fed and the Treasury for issuing some kind of digital dollar. And of course, in the bill, in the abstract, it said that this is not in competition with a potential CBDC. This is supposed to work in concert with. Not exactly sure exactly how that would happen, but it's interesting to think about like agencies, designing and promoting their own shitcoins within the government itself. So yeah, David, I want to pass it over to you if you have any thoughts on like CBDCs and eCash competing with Bitcoin. And do you think ultimately that we're going to see a world will have Bitcoin and some kind of digital dollar or yuan or whatever state-based currency working alongside it?
Yeah, I mean, almost absolutely. Like at the point where there are 80 central banks that are exploring the possibilities of a central bank digital currency, at the point where there are many benefits if you are the state to a CBDC, and insofar as Bitcoin is Bitcoin, yeah, like I do think that pretty soon we'll be living in a world where Bitcoin is kind of sitting there right alongside a CBDC. For me, privacy is just the biggest concern. And there are there's a real sort of danger as we cross from the sort of physical world into a world that is increasingly digital, right? Like we have to choose and be very deliberate about what rights we keep and bring with us, and what rights we leave behind. Cash does not require the promise of a lawmaker to be anonymous. If I hand Matthew a $10 bill, there's really no way of Matthew sort of going to anyone after the fact and saying, well, David Zell gave me this $10 bill. Cash is sort of truly pseudonymous. My main concern with central bank digital currencies, of course, there are many, but I think the one that's going to ultimately get the least amount of attention proportionate to its impact is the danger of having a centralized repository of everyone's financial data and transactions, because this stuff happens. Like, you sort of ask, will this happen alongside the proliferation of Bitcoin? I think the better question is, will the dollar alternatives, proliferate against a backdrop of a cashless society? Like, because that's the real thing, is that cash serves a very particular function in society. And for me, it's not enough to just say, oh, well, we promise not to peak, which is like what some of these CBDC proposals essentially are saying, like, well, it's private, but of course it can't be too private. Like, we need more than sort of assurances from political leaders that these things will have the sort of requisite privacy. I haven't done enough looking into the eCash proposal to really say. From what I understand, at like a very cursory level, it doesn't involve. I know it's sort of a token-based thing. It's not an account-based thing. I've read some stuff that says that you don't have to KYC when you use it, but I'm not sure. What I do know, however, is that we should all be wary when the government says that a tool that they're going to give us anonymous and will confer us privacy. I'm trying to the Postal Inspection Service predates the Constitution by like 10 years. Like, we have been surveilling people's mail. That was invented in 1775. What was the Constitution? Like 87. So, it is in this country, like on this land, we have been surveilling people's mail for longer than we have had like the Bill of Rights. And wow. Yeah, I think, and there's a reason that privacy is not in the Constitution like once. I don't think it's because people are concerned about privacy. It's because they could not imagine the profound ways in which the progression of technology would allow for the degradation of our privacy. And so, to that end, my main sort of takeaway from all of this is that we need to verify that it is insufficient to just trust the government when they say that a new form of money that they're offering us will be just like cash, because my hunch is that it probably won't be. Obviously, I would love to be proven wrong. I'm not like rooting for an Orwellian state currency, but my guess is that it won't be nearly as private as they claim it will.
I would put a lot of Bitcoin betting on the accuracy of that guess. So you see something like privacy respecting features of physical cash in a state-run digital dollar, and it doesn't make any sense. I do not believe it. I don't believe you. All right, gentlemen, I know you both have to head out. We're at the top of the hour almost. So I just want to say thank you so much for your work and for your time today. It's been a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Had a blast.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll just sort of close by saying, David's not going to shill himself, so I'll shill for him. So he's executive director, right? So this is his baby. He really built this thing from scratch. You really should have seen him at the Bitcoin conference, just like a tornado, working on 2 hours of sleep and 6 espresso shots every night. And
I did
yeah,
experience that.
yeah, he recruited me. He got Troy Cross. He's really got like a gaggle of like experts here, and I'm probably like the least expert among them. So yeah, we have like a spot on the website. You can go to btcpolicy.org, put your email in. I think there might be some future, ways of getting some information out there. There's also, a spot to actually contribute. You can donate. I think even Bitcoin you can donate. Bitcoin Policy Institute would be a good, nice way to do that. But also, yeah, engage. I think if you've got good ideas, right? Like we just created this thing from scratch, where David did. And I think my takeaway was like, I was not engaged in this conversation very publicly at all until just getting on Twitter and, letting my thoughts unfold, not knowing exactly how coherent they were. And it turned out, there's some nuggets there that could be unpacked in the right form. And I think that's really a lot of Bitcoiners are really producing a lot of great content. Sometimes it's in our own silos. And so one of the things we're trying to do is like open up those silos and make sure that like content, which is really good, is packaged in the right format that's useful for the broader audience. Like we're thinking like, 20 years ahead of where these developments could go. And most of the policy world, most of the public is like on step 1 here. And so sometimes it's about like, bringing it back to basics and trying to, think about where you were in that first few months of becoming a Bitcoiner and like approaching kind of your engagement with the world, like through that lens. Whereas like with the Bitcoin community, we like talking, like the 10 steps ahead. And trying to balance between those two is important. So otherwise you just come off like a crazy person sometimes. So that's like my little parting words of wisdom as I was sort of getting into this policy, sort of policy angle here. But
nice.
That's what I got.
Thanks, Matthew. I appreciate that. All I'll add is that we're not really big on Twitter yet. Like we don't have a BPI Twitter. A lot of our work kind of involves kind of private meetings, stuff like that. But don't take that as a sign that you can't get involved. DM me on Twitter. I'm just like my name, David Zell. You can find me pretty easily. We are there's so many people that have reached out that are kind of helping Troy and Margot on a research paper they're doing that are kind of, there are so many ways to get involved and help out with what we're doing. And so, hit me up if you want to learn more. Hit me up if you're interested in the work that we're doing. And if not, just pay attention because I think you'll continue to see awesome work from people like Matthew reaching audiences outside of our little fun echo chamber on Twitter. I'm looking forward to the future for BPI and thanks for having us, man.
Absolutely, guys. Great work. Really important work, I think. So I really appreciate taking some time today, and we'll call it a wrap there.
Awesome.
All right. So that's it for this episode of Swan Signal Live. Normally we do go over to Spaces for Q&A, but we're not able to make that happen today. I will hop over there here in just a second with Sam and Jacob and see if anybody wants to come up on stage and say a few things or ask any questions that we might be able to riff on for a little bit. So we will hop over there here in just a minute. I want to add a little personal note that I think this is important. I know a lot of people out there are apathetic about being involved in government with obviously fantastic reasons, with good reasons, absolutely justified. But I do believe that politicians will listen to constituents, especially on a state level and even on like a House and Senate level. And if you take a look at the infrastructure bill and the organization that was put together by some of the policy institutes that work on crypto and Bitcoin at that point, certainly made a lot of noise to the point where there were, there's 2 or 3 days of debate on this small clause in the infrastructure bill that related to crypto and Bitcoin. So this obviously does work. It's empirically proven. We've seen it happen recently. And so if you can take some time to talk to your representatives about Bitcoin, to teach them about what's going on, to watch and kind of follow the stuff that's being put out by SAT Center and BPI and the like, send them some information, send them a book, send them a pamphlet, an article, something like that. Just let them know that you're interested in Bitcoin, that's important to you and why it's important to you. And it does actually make a difference, I believe, especially if we do it kind of en masse. And this is, if there's one thing that will get you sort of involved into politics in American, kind of political world again, I hope it might be Bitcoin, because it's so important to you and to the world that we separate money and states, in the long run, and that we confer this sort of individual freedom and sovereignty in terms of money, which is an incredibly important tool of power. And either someone else is going to wield it over you, or you're going to wield it on your own behalf. So I do want to encourage you all to try to get involved in some way. It can be as little as an email, a phone call. They listen to all those messages, etc. So that stuff does add up. All right, so that's a wrap for the YouTube portion of the show today. Of course, go to swan.com. Check out our offerings there if you're not already stacking with Swan. And it's just excited to continue to build this company out by the end of this year. I'm just stoked to see where we are now. We've made so much progress over the past 12 months. So thanks for all of your support, everybody out there who's already stacking with Swan and recommending our company and our service. Really appreciate your support and time, and we'll hope to continue to serve you as well as we can. Thanks all.